Bay of Biscay, April 1943, and in Luftwaffe intelligence files, the American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt still carried the dismissive annotation, zu schwer für den Luftkampf, too heavy for combat. German analysts regarded the massive radial-engined fighter as little more than an overweight experiment, a machine that would never rival the agility of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. 18 months earlier, when the first photographs of the aircraft reached Berlin, senior officers laughed at his bulk, calling it a flying beer keg, a target so fat that even an inexperienced flak gunner could not miss. Doctrine assured them that American fighters would remain inferior escorts at best, incapable of challenging Luftwaffe dominance over Europe. Yet already, in the spring skies over France, that assumption was beginning to collapse. Jagdgeschwader pilots, returning from missions, reported duels in which the supposed clumsy Thunderbolt refused to fall, shrugging off cannon hits that would have shredded a lighter airframe, then climbing back into combat on the brute force of its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. The aircraft's sheer size, once mocked, now revealed a different truth. It could absorb punishment like a bomber and still fight. German combat reports noted with unease that engagements once expected to last seconds stretched into prolonged battles, the P-47 pilot fighting with relentless persistence, his armor protecting him from the very weapons designed to end the encounter. For the first time since 1940, Luftwaffe doctrine encountered an American machine that did not conform to expectation. Where German fighters relied on speed and sharp maneuver, the Thunderbolt answered with resilience and firepower, its 850 caliber machine guns pouring out streams of tracer that forced even veteran aces to break off attack runs. In the ready rooms of occupied France, pilots spoke of the strange reality that this giant American brute could not be bullied from the sky. What had been dismissed as a design flaw, too heavy, too thick, too slow, was emerging as the foundation of an unexpected nightmare. And behind the lines, Allied planners were already conceiving new missions for the Thunderbolt that would stretch the boundaries of air combat itself. What the Luftwaffe saw as an oversized escort was about to transform into something neither side had fully imagined. A single-engine fighter capable of carrying the load of a bomber, rewriting the balance of power in the skies over Europe. Over the Channel, in late May 1943, bomber formations of B-17s and B-24s crossed into occupied territory with their new guardians, squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts climbing high above the contrails. German interceptors expected an easy harvest, convinced that the bulky American fighters could never keep pace with streamlined Messerschmitts. But when the attack came, something unexpected unfolded. The Thunderbolts did not scatter under pressure. They closed ranks, diving with astonishing speed, using their weight not as a weakness, but as a weapon. Luftwaffe pilots soon discovered that a head-on pass against a P-47 meant staring into 8 synchronized machine guns firing at a rate of more than 100 rounds per second. Armor plating shielded the cockpit, while self-sealing tanks blunted incendiary strikes. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 2 documented frustration as cannon shells struck home, yet failed to bring down the American giants. The Thunderbolts simply rolling back into formation, climbing again on raw horsepower. The word began to circulate among German squadrons. Sie stürzen nicht. They do not fall. The endurance of the P-47 also revealed a new dimension of the air war. While Spitfires and Mustangs fought with finesse, the Thunderbolt fought with endurance, covering the bombers for hours at altitudes where the Luftwaffe had once reigned supreme. Pilots soon realized that the aircraft's heavy frame allowed steep dives from high altitude, converting mass into velocity in a way few German machines could follow. Those who tried to chase often found their wings shuddering in compressibility, while the Thunderbolt streaked away, leveling out miles below and roaring back into the fight. To Allied air crews who had endured years of losses, the arrival of the P-47 was not just a reinforcement, it was a shield. And to Luftwaffe command, watching interception reports shift from confident victories to costly drawn-out engagements, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Americans had built a fighter that could escort, endure, and retaliate with devastating effect. The clumsy jug was turning into a storm front, and its true potential had only begun to emerge. By July 1943, the engineer's vision behind the Thunderbolt began to reveal itself in combat. Republic Aviation had never intended the P-47 to be a nimble duelist in the style of the Bf-109. It was designed as an aerial fortress around a single heart, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. That massive 18-cylinder radial produced over 2,000 horsepower, driving a propeller so broad it required unusually tall landing gear. German observers mocked the ungainly stance, unaware that beneath its bulk lay the blueprint for an entirely new category of fighter. The airframe itself was built like a tank. Where German fighters sought efficiency through light alloys and sleek lines, the Thunderbolt's designers embraced mass. Heavy armor plating protected the pilot, robust wings carried fuel in abundance, and the fuselage was broad enough to house an enormous turbo supercharger system that allowed the aircraft to breathe at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The result was a machine that could climb into the thin stratosphere, dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and still absorb punishment that would shred lighter designs. To American pilots transitioning from the lighter P-40s and P-39s, the Jug seemed alien at first. It was not quick to turn, not eager to roll. But in the vertical plane, it was unmatched. A Thunderbolt could drop from altitude in a near-supersonic dive, unleash a hurricane of fire from 850 caliber Brownings, and climb back into the heavens before its opponent could recover. Pilots soon discovered that fighting in the Jug meant using altitude as a weapon, trading agility for raw power. German intelligence analysts, poring over combat reports, struggled to categorize the new threat. Was it a heavy fighter? A bomber escort? Something in between? Each answer proved incomplete because the P-47 refused to fit existing doctrine. Its sheer size gave it reach, its construction gave it resilience, and its engine gave it freedom of maneuver across altitudes once considered safe for the Luftwaffe alone. The machine that had been written off as too heavy for combat was slowly rewriting the physics of air warfare. By September 1943, Allied commanders began testing the Thunderbolt in roles that stretched far beyond escort duty. What had started as a high-altitude guardian now descended low over the fields of France, carrying racks of bombs beneath its massive wings. At first, even American pilots doubted the experiment. Strapping ordnance to a single-seat fighter seemed reckless, and many questioned whether the overweight Jug could even lift the loads. But when the first sorties returned, the results silenced every doubt. P-47s dropped 500-pound bombs onto German rail yards, bridges, and convoys with accuracy that stunned ground observers. What surprised Luftwaffe reconnaissance even more was the sight of Thunderbolts climbing away after release, still bristling with ammunition, still able to turn back and fight. Unlike dedicated bombers, these machines needed no escort, and unlike light fighter bombers, they could absorb flak and return for another mission the same day. German flak crews reported their frustration in unit diaries. Shell bursts that would rip apart a Stuka or a Typhoon merely scarred the Jug's broad fuselage. Pilots wrote of seeing sparks leap across the armor plate, then vanish as the aircraft roared on, dropping its payload and diving away with the power of a heavy bomber condensed into a single engine. By the autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe was forced to acknowledge a new category of adversary, one that blurred every line between fighter and bomber. The doctrine of air power itself was shifting. Where once missions required formations of specialized aircraft, fighters for protection, bombers for destruction, the Thunderbolt began to merge those roles into a single platform. A lone pilot could now destroy a target, fight his way out, and return to base, compressing the work of squadrons into the effort of one machine. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced the realization that what they had dismissed as a lumbering curiosity had become something far more dangerous, a universal weapon designed to break the Reich's war machine from the sky. Winter 1943 over the Ardennes, and the Thunderbolt's transformation into a true strike fighter was undeniable. In missions once reserved for twin-engine jobos, single P-47s now carried a loadout that rivaled a light bomber. 2 1,000-pound bombs slung beneath the wings, another 500-pounder under the belly, and still the full complement of 850 caliber Brownings. For German troops on the ground, the sight was disorienting. A lone fighter diving with the firepower of a squadron. Luftwaffe reports from December recorded a growing unease. Crews expecting to duel with nimble escorts instead faced an aircraft that could appear over a rail line at dawn, drop a payload heavy enough to tear apart locomotives, then climb away with guns blazing. Reconnaissance photographs confirmed the damage. Shattered bridges, burned out convoys, entire supply depots struck not by bomb wings of the 8th Air Force, but by small formations of Thunderbolts acting alone. What confounded German analysts was the paradox of the design. One pilot, one engine, and a combat load approaching 2,500 pounds, a figure once reserved for medium bombers. American engineers had taken the mass once mocked as a flaw and converted it into capacity, building a fighter that carried the war on its back. Where B-17s required squadrons and elaborate planning, the Jug offered commanders a weapon of immediate response, able to hit targets of opportunity without sacrificing protection for the bomber streams. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, now faced an enemy that defied categorization. Dogfighting it proved costly, intercepting it nearly impossible, ignoring it fatal. By the dawn of 1944, the conclusion was inescapable. the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer simply a fighter. It had become a hybrid of roles, the first single-engine aircraft to wage war with the destructive weight of a heavy bomber and the resilience of a steel-plated fortress. Spring 1944 saw the Thunderbolt emerge not merely as a weapon, but as a doctrine-shattering force. Over northern France, groups of jugs swept down on rail yards and supply columns with a violence that stunned even hardened Wehrmacht veterans. German officers noted with alarm that entire panzer battalions found their movement stalled, not from lack of fuel or orders, but because bridges and crossroads were obliterated by fighter bombers striking in daylight with near impunity. For Luftwaffe squadrons tasked with defense, the problem became acute. A single P-47 could appear above a convoy, release its bombs, and still fight its way clear against interceptors. Flak units reported bitterly that barrages calibrated for bombers failed against the smaller, faster Thunderbolts. Jagdgeschwader pilots, accustomed to breaking bomber formations, now faced an opponent that answered their attacks with streams of heavy machine gun fire while continuing its strike mission. The German term Jagdbomber Albtraum, fighter bomber nightmare, began appearing in squadron diaries. What unsettled commanders most was the scale. Hundreds of Thunderbolts now operated daily from English bases, each carrying bomb loads once thought impossible for a single-engine aircraft. In effect, the Allies had multiplied their striking power without building new bombers, turning every Thunderbolt squadron into a dual-purpose force that could protect bombers in the morning and devastate ground targets in the afternoon. By the time reconnaissance photographs of wrecked bridges across the Seine and Loire reached Berlin, the truth was clear. The machine that had entered service as a supposed escort had become an all-purpose instrument of destruction. Its size, once ridiculed, had made it the most versatile aircraft in the Allied arsenal. To the Luftwaffe, still clinging to doctrines of specialized aircraft, the P-47 represented a revolution they had neither anticipated nor prepared to counter. June 1944, the beaches of Normandy and the thunder of artillery was joined by a new sound, the roar of P-47 Thunderbolts diving through cloud and smoke. For the German defenders, the shock was immediate. Where they expected heavy bombers overhead at fixed hours, instead came swarms of single-engine fighters carrying loads equal to a medium squadron strike. Each jug released 1,000-pound bombs onto coastal batteries, gun pits, and armored columns moving toward the invasion front, then wheeled into the sky, still armed with machine guns for strafing runs. Field reports from Wehrmacht commanders spoke with disbelief. Tanks attempting to counterattack were caught on open roads and hammered from above. Bridges vital for reinforcement collapsed in minutes, and ammunition depots erupted under strikes from aircraft that should, by every standard of doctrine, have been too small for such destruction. One after-action report from Panzer Lehr Division recorded that entire convoys dispersed into the countryside at the first sight of Thunderbolts, knowing that resistance was futile. Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled in desperation, but the tactical picture had shifted. P-47s now fought as much as they bombed. When Bf-109s dove on them, they found themselves facing not vulnerable strike planes, but fully armed fighters capable of rolling into combat the moment their bombs were gone. Even when caught low, the Jug's massive radial engine hauled it skyward in brutal climbs, while its armor bought pilots the seconds they needed to counterattack. By midsummer, the Luftwaffe High Command conceded in internal memoranda what frontline soldiers already knew. The Thunderbolt had rendered the old categories of air war meaningless. No longer was there a neat division between bomber, escort, and fighter. The Americans had built one machine that embodied all three, and in the skies over France, it was dismantling the Wehrmacht's ability to resist. By late summer 1944, the statistics spoke louder than any propaganda. Thunderbolt squadrons were flying thousands of sorties each week, dropping more tonnage of bombs on German positions than entire groups of medium bombers had managed 2 years earlier. The Luftwaffe, once confident that only heavy four-engine aircraft posed a strategic threat, now faced the reality that a single-seat fighter could devastate rail networks, armored columns, and fortified positions with equal efficiency. German intelligence officers compiled grim reports. Locomotives wrecked in their depots, fuel trains exploding in long chains of fire, bridges rendered useless within hours of repair. P-47 struck with precision, carrying bombs, rockets, and even napalm in growing numbers. What unnerved the defenders most was the tempo. A Jug could return to base, refuel, rearm, and be back over the front in less than 2 hours. The rhythm of destruction became relentless, hammering Wehrmacht logistics until entire offensives stalled for lack of supplies. In Luftwaffe ready rooms, veteran pilots tried to brief newcomers on how to fight the American behemoth. Avoid head-on passes. Never chase a diving Jug. Strike only when he is heavy with bombs. But even these tactics collapsed in practice, because the Thunderbolt could jettison its ordnance and instantly revert to a pure fighter. Accounts emerged of German interceptors diving confidently at what looked like a lumbering bomber, only to be shredded when the Jug's pilot released his load and turned the tables in seconds. By the autumn campaigns across France and Belgium, the Thunderbolt was more than a weapon. It had become a symbol. To Allied troops, the sound of its engine overhead meant survival and momentum. To German soldiers, it meant exposure, helplessness, and a collapse of the very certainty that had guided their doctrine since the early Blitzkrieg years. The fighter they once mocked as a bloated target now haunted their every movement, rewriting the daily reality of the battlefield. Autumn 1944, as Allied armies pushed toward the German frontier, the Thunderbolt's reputation reached a new peak. To Luftwaffe crews, the Jug was no longer simply a nuisance. It had become an airborne juggernaut whose presence dictated tactics on the ground as much as in the air. Pilots who once scoffed at its size now referred to it in combat reports with a tone of wary respect, noting that the P-47 could appear low over treetops with bomb racks full, then climb into the sky and fight like a frontline interceptor. German panzer commanders described the terror of trying to move armor in daylight. Columns that had once relied on camouflage and speed now found themselves under constant threat from roving Thunderbolts. Even at dusk, the Jug's silhouette was visible against the horizon, diving suddenly with rockets that blasted tanks apart before anti-aircraft units could react. To the men inside those armored vehicles, the experience was unnerving. They were being hunted not by swarms of bombers, but by lone fighters that seemed to appear everywhere at once. Within Luftwaffe headquarters, tactical discussions grew desperate. Some officers proposed dispersing resources. Others suggested strengthening flak along every critical roadway. Yet the Thunderbolt's speed and versatility made these countermeasures nearly futile. Where defenses were thick, the Jug struck elsewhere. Where interceptors managed to climb into range, the P-47s jettisoned bombs and turned the air into a killing ground. The German term Donnerkeil, Thunderbolt, began to circulate in unit diaries, not as a nickname, but as an admission of its destructive role. By November, it was clear that the P-47 had erased the line between tactical and strategic warfare. What had once required heavy bombers and elaborate planning could now be executed by squadrons of single-seat fighters. The Luftwaffe found itself not only outnumbered, but outclassed by a weapon that defied every principle of air doctrine it had trusted since 1939. The fat target had become the hunter, and the Reich was paying the price. Winter 1944 brought the final collapse of German illusions about the Thunderbolt. In the bitter fighting of the Ardennes, where snow-covered forests and roads turned to ice, the P-47 proved it could wage war in any season. When the Wehrmacht launched its last great offensive, American ground troops braced for armored spearheads pushing through the fog. But when the skies cleared, it was the Jug that turned the tide. Thunderbolts roared over the bulge in waves, each carrying bombs, rockets, and full ammunition loads. They blasted bridges across the Our and Meuse, shattered convoys threading through forest roads, and struck fuel depots the German offensive desperately depended on. Pilots reported destroying dozens of tanks in a single day, while infantrymen on the ground wrote in diaries that, "The Jug is our guardian angel." For the first time, German commanders admitted in after-action reports that entire armored divisions had been halted not by Allied armor, but by relentless fighter-bomber attacks. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted interception found the odds hopeless. Many Thunderbolts carried external fuel tanks, giving them endurance to patrol for hours. When engaged, they dropped ordnance and fought with the ferocity of a frontline interceptor. One veteran of JG-26 noted grimly, "They arrive as bombers and remain as fighters. There is no safe moment to attack them." Even flak batteries, once the last line of defense, reported catastrophic losses of equipment as P-47s strafed gun positions with merciless precision. By January 1945, the evidence was overwhelming. The Thunderbolt had become the nightmare the Luftwaffe never anticipated. A single-seat aircraft able to paralyze offensives, bleed supply lines dry, and then stand its ground against fighters. What had begun as a supposedly overweight escort was now dismantling the Reich's last hopes for counterattack, one burning convoy at a time. By February 1945, the transformation of the Thunderbolt was complete, in the eyes of both friend and foe. In Allied operational summaries, the P-47 was described not merely as a fighter bomber, but as a strategic weapon in its own right. In German reports, it was catalogued with the same dread once reserved for heavy bombers, a machine whose arrival signaled certain destruction. Squadrons of Jugs fanned across the Reich, striking oil refineries, marshalling yards, and supply depots with precision once thought possible only for massed bomber groups. Yet, unlike the lumbering B-17s, the Thunderbolts arrived low, fast, and dispersed, their attacks unpredictable and nearly impossible to intercept. Luftwaffe analysts noted bitterly that radar warning stations provided little relief. By the time an alarm was sounded, the strike was already underway, bombs falling, guns raking the target area. What unsettled German defenders most was the seamless way the Thunderbolt shifted roles. At dawn, it could escort bombers over the Ruhr. At midday, it could dive on tank columns along the Siegfried Line. And by evening, it could strafe airfields with merciless accuracy. One aircraft, one pilot, and a combat load still rivaling a medium bomber. The Reich's defenders, accustomed to dividing their resources against specialized threats, now faced a weapon that blurred every category at once. Wehrmacht officers along the Western Front reported morale sinking rapidly. Soldiers dug trenches deeper, camouflaged vehicles more carefully, yet still the Thunderbolts found them. They learned to fear not just the sight of contrails, but the distant thunder of a radial engine that might, at any moment, descend into a lethal dive. By the closing months of the war, the Luftwaffe's great miscalculation was undeniable. The aircraft mocked as clumsy and too heavy for combat had become the universal predator of the European skies. March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, the Thunderbolt operated with a freedom that underscored the Luftwaffe's collapse. Bridges vital to German defense crumbled under precision strikes, armored trains were destroyed in their depots, and columns retreating eastward found themselves harassed day and night by the Jug's relentless presence. German officers admitted in reports that entire sectors were paralyzed, not by enemy armor, but by continuous fighter-bomber sorties that erased any sense of security behind the front. For ground troops, the P-47 became a symbol of inevitability. Wehrmacht units moving by daylight did so under constant fear. Their convoys scattered into woods at the first engine growl overhead. Even movement at night offered no true safety. With rockets, bombs, and flares, the Thunderbolts turned darkness into a trap, hunting down stragglers and striking isolated bridges or river ferries, desperately trying to sustain the defense. What astonished Allied planners was the aircraft's endurance. Many Thunderbolts flew 2, even 3 sorties a day, each time carrying bomb loads heavier than the Luftwaffe's own Ju-87 Stukas or FW-190 Jabos could manage. The cycle was brutal. Takeoff, strike, fight if necessary, return, rearm, and repeat. German intelligence concluded bitterly that the Americans had built a machine able to replace 2 or 3 categories of aircraft at once, multiplying its impact far beyond its numbers. By now, Luftwaffe veterans had ceased calling the Jug a clumsy target. In combat diaries, they described it as an unshakable hunter, a predator that absorbed punishment and still returned for the kill. The psychological shift was complete. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as too heavy for combat, had become the defining weapon of a new era of air warfare, an aircraft that fought, bombed, and survived, rewriting the rules while the Reich itself crumbled beneath its shadow. April 1945, the Reich in ruins, and the Thunderbolt seemed everywhere at once. From the industrial valleys of the Ruhr to the forests of Bavaria, P-47s prowled the skies in relentless sweeps. Bridges already shattered were struck again. Convoys dispersed across fields were burned in place, and airfields that once launched proud Jagdgeschwader now smoldered under strafing runs that left wrecked fuselages in neat rows along cratered runways. For the German soldier on the ground, the Jug had become an inescapable presence. A single machine could appear suddenly, drop a 1,000-pound bomb into a village crossroads, then circle back with guns blazing to rake columns of vehicles. Accounts from Wehrmacht survivors spoke of men abandoning tanks to hide in ditches at the mere sight of its silhouette. They knew that the fat-bodied fighter was no clumsy target, but a death sentence delivered from above. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the despair was palpable. Reports confirmed what commanders no longer dared deny. The Thunderbolt had erased the last hope of organized retreat. Roads that might have carried reinforcements to Berlin were cratered, supply dumps annihilated, and fuel deliveries shattered before they reached the front. Even the most optimistic analysts admitted that without fuel, armor, or mobility, the Wehrmacht could no longer fight a modern war. The P-47 had cut the arteries of the Reich. To Allied pilots, the Jug had transformed from a misunderstood brute into the ultimate warplane. It fought in the morning, bombed in the afternoon, and strafed until dusk, its radial engine hauling it home through smoke and flak. By April, the truth was undeniable. This single-engine fighter had accomplished what entire bomber fleets once struggled to achieve. It had rewritten the doctrine of air warfare and, in doing so, accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse beyond recovery. May during 1945, and the guns of Europe finally fell silent. Among the wreckage of cities and the shattered columns of a once proud Wehrmacht, one silhouette lingered in the minds of survivors: the broad, barrel-chested Thunderbolt. For the Luftwaffe, it remained the embodiment of a bitter lesson, that what they had once mocked as ungainly and overweight had become the weapon that crushed their doctrine and denied them the sky. Post-war analyses confirmed what combat had already revealed. A single P-47 could haul 2,500 pounds of bombs, fire hundreds of rounds from 8 heavy machine guns, and return safely from missions that combined the work of a fighter, a bomber, and a ground attack aircraft. No other machine of the war had so seamlessly merged these roles. To the Allies, it had been more than an airplane. It was a universal war machine, a tool of flexibility and brute power that shaped strategy as surely as tanks and artillery on the ground. For historians, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of transition. It was not the sleek duelist of the early war, nor the fragile dive bomber of the Blitzkrieg era. It was a herald of the future. Multi-role aircraft capable of shifting from air superiority to ground attack without pause, delivering destructive loads once thought possible only for heavy bombers. By day, it looked like a fat target. By night, it became a relentless hunter. In the rubble-strewn streets of Cologne, on the broken bridges of the Rhine, and in the memories of German troops who had fled into force as its shadow passed overhead, the legacy was clear. The Thunderbolt had accelerated the collapse of the Reich, not by sheer numbers alone, but by rewriting the very rules of air combat. Its versatility, its endurance, and its raw power marked the dawn of a new era, one where no sanctuary existed beneath the clouds, and where the line between fighter and bomber had vanished forever. Summer 1945, with victory secured, Allied commanders reviewed the statistics that told the story behind the rubble. Thunderbolt squadrons had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties in Europe, dropped thousands of tons of bombs, and destroyed or damaged tens of thousands of vehicles, locomotives, and armored units. No single-engine aircraft had ever carried such responsibility on its shoulders, and none had performed with such relentless consistency. Captured German officers, questioned after the surrender, admitted that the P-47 had altered their very perception of warfare. They spoke of entire divisions immobilized by fighter bombers, of bridges destroyed faster than engineers could repair them, of morale shattered by the knowledge that even a lone jug overhead meant annihilation. One Luftwaffe major summed it up bluntly. "We prepared for bombers. We prepared for fighters. We did not prepare for one machine to be both." Among Allied airmen, affection for the Thunderbolt was boundless. Pilots who had first cursed its bulk now praised its ruggedness, recalling missions where flak tore holes through the fuselage and cannon shells shattered panels. Yet the jug still dragged them home. They joked that the aircraft could dive through a stone wall and come out flying. Beneath the humor lay the truth. The P-47 had given them survival, and with survival came victory. Strategists in Washington and London drew wider conclusions. The days of rigidly specialized aircraft were fading. The war had shown that versatility multiplied effectiveness, and that resilience mattered as much as speed. The Thunderbolt was not elegant, but it was decisive, and its performance pointed the way toward the multi-role fighters that would dominate the second half of the century. In its thunderous passage across Europe, the P-47 had closed one era of air combat and opened another. Autumn 1945, as post-war evaluations filled Allied archives, the Thunderbolt's legacy crystallized in stark comparisons. Analysts noted that in a single mission, one P-47 could deliver the same bomb weight as an entire formation of Stukas, yet still engage enemy fighters on equal terms. It had done the work of multiple aircraft types, compressing roles that once required squadrons into the strength of one pilot and one machine. German engineers studying wreckage of downed Thunderbolts after the war were forced to admit their misjudgment. The supposed flaw of mass had in fact been the key to success. That bulk allowed it to carry heavy loads, mount armor thick enough to defy cannon fire, and house the supercharger system that gave it reach across the altitudes. In dismissing it as clumsy, the Luftwaffe had blinded itself to the revolution it represented. For Allied ground forces, the jug had become part of daily life. Soldiers advancing through France, Belgium, and Germany remembered the sight of its broad wings banking overhead before unleashing bombs that shattered enemy defenses. Infantrymen called it their flying artillery. Tank crews swore by its protection, and commanders relied on its constant presence to keep the enemy unbalanced. Few other aircraft inspired such trust from those it defended. By the close of 1945, historians were already framing the Thunderbolt as more than a fighter. It had been a turning point in air doctrine, proof that one aircraft could carry the weight of a bomber, the resilience of armor, and the punch of a gunship. In doing so, it had accelerated the downfall of the Wehrmacht and reshaped the very definition of air power. What began as a machine laughed at for its size had ended the war as the hammer that broke the Reich.